Hey guys, in this video I'll be going over all of the upcoming vocation balance changes in Tibia. This has been a long time coming, and we've been waiting to see how exactly they're going to change each vocation to seem unique, and they've released an announcement with a description of all the changes to each vocation, as well as global changes to other stuff in the game that should affect all vocations, some more than others. So like I said, I'll be going over each and every one of these changes, say what I think about them, say how they're going to affect the meta, and in particular I'm going to go into extra detail about the changes to druids, because I think the vocation that will be affected the most is druids, but also I'm a druid main, so I will probably have the most input when it comes to those specific changes. So the first major change is auto attacks and charms. This affects pretty much only paladins, and what this boils down to is that up until now, paladins had roughly twice the likelihood of proccing charms on enemies during hunts than any other vocation, because they have 2 AoE attacks during each attack turn. So their diamond arrows would proc charms on a large group of enemies, and likewise the runes, which they could use on the same attack turn, would also have a chance of proccing charms on a large group of enemies. Now, this will be reduced to only proccing charms on the primary target of the auto attack. All other enemies that are hit by the diamond arrows are not going to be affected, but enemies hit by runes and Massan should still be affected. So the second major change is to AoE runes. Essentially, they lowered the area of effect by 1, so the radius is going to be 1 square meter lower, and I'm going to show you in a second what that looks like, but it says their damage will be increased. By how much? Who the fuck knows? So as you can see, this is what's most likely going to be the new range of AoE runes. So everything outside the red line is what it is now. The red border is what the runes are likely going to be after the update. And in green is where the EK would box and where you would need to aim the rune for maximum effectiveness. Note that the 4 corners of the box, the diagonals from where the EK is boxing, doesn't get hit. So even in the optimal aiming situation where you're aimed directly on the EK, you are going to miss everything that's diagonal to the box. Like, all of this area is not going to be hit. All of this area is not going to be hit. It's going to be pretty terrible. This is pretty catastrophic. And this will probably mean that a lot of people are going to stop free aiming, because before you had some leeway when you were free aiming runes, but with these changes you're going to have to be pretty accurate with them to maximize the amount of damage you can deal with them. The next change that we're going to discuss is to energy rings. So what's going to change is that using an energy ring, when you take damage, you take 3 times as much as you would now. And this would seem pretty terrible on its face, but we're also going to go over the potion improvements. So all vocations will be able to use the next higher tier mana potion. In other words, EKs will be able to use great mana potions, and RPs will be able to use ultimate mana potions, and so will monks. No change for mages, obviously. We're not going to get any better potions. Maybe we're going to get superior potions. But additionally, 2 universal mana potions will be added that can be used by all vocations. These restore the same amount of mana as a superior or ultimate mana potion, but cost 50% more gold. I'm telling you right now, this 50% more gold is nothing. So EKs will be able to use the equivalent of ultimate mana potions that cost 50% more, which is literally nothing. So they're going to be slightly more expensive, but the quality of life and the power you get out of it, especially in conjunction with energy rings, is going to be insane. So you can't put on an energy ring for as long, but all vocations will be able to keep their mana up much more easily, so that way energy rings will benefit from it very much. The next change is to ultimate healing runes, and this is probably the biggest change out of all of them, including all of the vocation balance changes. That is that no longer will MSs be required to, or even able to, use ultimate healing runes to heal their teammates. Of course, paladins and monks are not going to be able to use them either. Neither are mages for that matter. So ultimate healing runes, you can't use them on other players. This is going to shift the meta of team hunting to the point where I think that it might even be advisable to take 2 druids with you on a hunt, even though it doesn't really benefit you in terms of the party XP bonus. But just by the sheer fact that you can't count on other team members UHing you anymore, you would need at least 1 ED that's very good at what he's doing, or to have 2 EDs and then distribute the new healing abilities that we're going to discuss in a sec between the 2 EDs, so that way you could kind of compensate for the lack of ultimate healing runes as a backup healing mechanism. The next one is a relatively minor change, but it is a giant quality of life improvement. So up until now, you had offensive, medium, and defensive stances that nobody actually ever changed whatsoever. So if you're an EK or RP, you always, or monk, you always had it on offensive, and if you're a mage, you always had it as defensive, and there was almost never any reason to change it whatsoever. So that considered, they just removed it altogether and instead gave it just a flat 20% increase to both the defense with shields and offense with auto attacks. So mages will now actually be able to benefit from slightly stronger auto attacks, presumably, and knights, paladins, and monks will be able to benefit from some extra defense without changing their stance at all. So this is just a W in my opinion. This is just a necessary change. They probably should have done this a long time ago. Mitigation improvements, likewise, a relatively minor change, and that is that they're increasing the effects of mitigation both from wheel and from gems. Mitigation is a very complicated system in and of itself, so I'll not get into it right now, but what this means is generally just slightly increased damage tolerance from whatever character and whatever build you were making up until now. Potion improvements we've already discussed, and vocation adjustments, we're going to get into that right now. So we're starting off with Knight, and right off the bat, they have changes to Blood Rage and Protector. Now, instead of being spells that you can cast at will, like support spells that you can cast at will, now they are essentially stances that you could toggle between. And this is a pretty huge quality of life improvement, but if you keep in mind that other vocations got actual legitimate stances that changed their gameplay completely, I think here Cipsoft were being a bit lazy, and they've essentially reduced the requirement for them to implement 2 new game-changing stances and just took what already existed and made it passives instead of spells. I'm not very impressed with this, but considering that Knights overall seem to have gotten the best deal out of all vocations in this update in terms of like they got a lot more positives with almost no negatives that I can think of, I think that's fair. Improved self-healings. Knight healing will be adjusted in 2 key ways. Bruisebane, Wound Cleansing, Fair Wound Cleansing cooldowns will be increased to 2 seconds. This is pretty bad, because EKs needed way more reliable and better healing to keep up with other vocations. Now they're only having it better healing, but not as reliable. Healing now scales more strongly with magic level in addition with shielding. This is a very positive change. I love this. This is actually pretty interesting and pretty cool. Sadly, I think they should not have also increased the cooldown to 2 seconds. If you cut in half the amount of healing they can do based on the cooldowns, I really doubt that EKs will be better off than they are now when it comes to self-healing. But I really don't know. Presumably, they claim at least that it's going to be slightly better than it is now, but I don't know about that. It does make healing spells less spammable, which is a good thing because EKs need to spam self-healing on higher levels just to be able to assist the ED keeping them alive, and EKs that don't self-heal should uninstall the game, in my opinion. And this means that they need to self-heal half as often. But EKs are going to constantly spam the self-healing button anyway, so I don't see how this is going to help them very much. Regardless, I just hope that the healing that EKs are going to be able to do is going to be at least on par with what it is now, if not better. 2 new defensive spells, or one of them is that damage scales with shield defense instead of weapon attack. This has a potential to be pretty crazy, because this might, depending on how they implement it, make using one-handed builds deal as much damage as two-handed builds. And I don't like that very much, because right now EKs face the dilemma of using shield, which gives them an extra imbue, and one-handed weapons, which deal less damage, or use two-handed weapons, take extra damage, but deal extra damage, and then they would be able to choose which one they want. I don't know how they're going to implement this, but potentially one-handed weapons might be the meta in terms of damage. I don't know if I like that, but I guess we'll see how it's implemented, and we'll comment on it more when the update actually comes out. Targets will automatically miss their next auto attack. These spells further emphasize the knight's defensive role. I don't know what this means. I don't know how this is going to work. Does that mean that every time that an EK takes an auto attack from an enemy, it's going to skip the next one? So in other words, our EK is going to take only half the melee damage? I don't know. This is interesting, and I approve of this, because EKs do need a lot more damage reduction overall, because UH runes are removed from the game. That would make it way more difficult for EKs to stay alive, so everything that helps EKs survive is a good thing in the new meta, as far as I'm concerned. Augmented front sweep will gain significantly increased life leech. I think this is completely pointless. It's nice, nothing to write home about. Battle healing will be reworked to boost all healing spells with the bonus tripled while shield is equipped. Again, arguably this is going to make two-handed weapons obsolete. I hope that's not going to be the case, but regardless, it seems as if using one-handed weapons is going to be way more viable in the upcoming update. So now for RPs. Sharpshooter and Swiftfoot, at first they considered making them stances. I'm glad they didn't, because again, it's pretty lazy to just take support spells and change them into passives, so that instead of changing what the vocation actually feels like playing, instead it just saves you from needing to press a button every once in a while to apply the buffs to yourself. But what they're doing is introducing a bunch of the wheel effects of Sharpshooter and Swiftfoot as baseline into the actual spells themselves. That's nice. I'm pretty sure RPs are going to be happy about this, but I'm pretty sure they would appreciate better stances than the ones they got. Speaking of which, the new stances are probably one of the worst changes I could tell so far, at least as far as the vocations. I'm not talking about UHs, but as far as the stances goes, these are probably the worst, because offensive stance increases auto attack damage. By how much? Who the fuck knows? Not double damage, but double the increase against non-adjacent targets. In other words, RPs are almost never going to be able to utilize this stance whatsoever, because RPs box all the time, both in team hunts and solo, and even when they're not boxing, they would like to keep the enemies in close proximity so that they could group them up better for AoE attacks. No longer that's going to be the case, because now they're incentivized to keep their distance away from their enemies, which is not very practical when it comes to hunting either solo or team RP. An RP boxes next to the EK a lot of times, and both the offensive stance, which doesn't apply to non-adjacent targets, and the defensive stance, which doesn't apply to adjacent targets. Both of these mean that RPs are encouraged to keep their distance away from their targets. So again, this is terrible. I think RPs should, if anything, double the damage against non-adjacent targets. That's fine, but reduce damage from adjacent targets. That would have been way better. Because if you're boxed as an RP and you don't get any defensive bonus from the defensive stance, and you're gonna box so you don't get any benefits from the offensive stance either, what's the point to the new stances in the first place? New spells. Not much to say about them because we have no idea what the fuck they are. Ethereal Barrage, physical, scaling with distance, fighting, and magic level. That's nice in terms of damage, but what is it? Who knows? Divine Barrage, what is it? Who knows? It scales only with magic level, so unless it has decent base damage, this is going to be not very impressive. Additional adjustment, Divine Caldera base power increased to 160. I don't know what it was before. I'm not an RP. I don't know how significant this is. Will of Power adjustments, as we said, because they implemented all of these into Sharpshooter and Swiftfoot by default, they needed to change some of the perks in the wheel. So instead of augmented Sharpshooter, you have augments for the new spell Ethereal Barrage. And Swiftfoot, instead of that, you have increases to Divine Barrage, or modifications to Divine Barrage. Higher damage and Mana Leech. That might be nice. Larger area is definitely nice. New ammunition. This is really, really good. But rather than making the vocations more different with these, this actually makes RPs kind of like worse mages in a way, because now they have 5 new arrow types planned. A lesser diamond arrow, that's irrelevant. That's just a diamond arrow for lower level vocation, for lower level RPs. And they will also have elemental AoE arrows, which they state are not intended to replace diamond arrows. In other words, they're going to be pretty weak. So it's nice that they get elemental arrows as an option, but the fact that their damage can't really compete with diamond arrows isn't very promising. So now to Monk. Mass Spirit Mend is made more reliable and simplified. So it no longer consumes Harmony, but it no longer benefits from a Harmony multiplier. And to compensate for that, they presumably lowered the cooldown. I don't know what adjusted means, but I'll presume and hope that it means lower. And base healing increased. So essentially, this is made more reliable and more consistent. So you don't have to depend on Harmony level or anything like that. You just cast it whenever it's off cooldown. And this is going to be absolutely necessary in Tibia with UHs removed, because MSs can't heal anybody anymore. Even RPs can't heal anybody anymore. So it all falls down on the shoulders of EDs or monks. So the more consistent a monk can heal, the easier it's going to be for the ED to keep the entire team alive, which is now going to fall pretty much exclusively on their shoulders. Virtue of Justice and Mentor Other, these are just passive buffs while this is active. And monks will benefit from all of these bonuses if they're serene, and even if they're not serene, they still get the fist fighting bonus. This is pretty nice. Now, ranged gameplay, it seems like they're shifting towards monks being able to deal with monsters at a range. So they're giving them basically a diamond arrow sized AoE, or similar to diamond arrows. And that AoE is a ranged builder. So essentially it's like throwing a rune on a monster, and it hits the target and all nearby enemies. So essentially like a rune. And this is pretty interesting, because monks for the most part can only deal with monsters that are right in front of them, but this way they can actually tank against a wall and hit more monsters than just the ones that they're wall boxing with. Mystic Repulse, I'm not sure what this is, but lowered cooldown, absolutely a good thing. Wheel of Destiny adjustments. I don't know what this is. I don't know how impactful this is. I don't know how impactful this is. But sweeping takedown is augments now the ranged diamond arrow sized attack instead. Flurry of Blows now has increased range instead of life leech. So now to the more interesting changes to sorcerers and druids, which for decades now have been pretty much the same vocation with very minor changes between how you play them. And the community's been begging Sipsoft for a very long time to make them distinguished from one another so that each one will fill its own niche and they won't have to overlap. And it seems that that's where they're really going with this update. And Sorcerer, for the most part, is going to experience the most significant changes. First and foremost, by virtue of them not needing to UH anymore. So, from now on, in bosses and hunts, sorcerers don't have to give a shit about anybody else in their team except themselves and them dealing damage and maybe debuffing enemies. For the most part, there's nothing they can do to help their teammates, so they are a pure DPS role, which completely simplifies how you would play a sorcerer, because now you don't have to have this pain in the ass UH mechanic that you have to aim UHs and all that kind of stuff. It's just completely removed. Everything is streamlined. Now, elemental stances is going to be a completely new way in which sorcerers are played. So essentially all of their spells can have modified elements. So you could have a Death Hell's Core UE, and you could have an Energy Hell's Core UE, or you could have a Death Viscor with extended range, or a Fire Viscor with extended range. All of these things could be interchangeable with this new elemental stances mechanic, and it's almost like a kind of mini game where you have to do interesting combinations to make specific rotations work. And this is going to be really, really interesting, and probably a reason why sorcerers are going to be extremely fun to play post-update. So, increased power for matching elemental spells. Okay, so for starters, you have 3 stances: Fire, Energy, and Death. In all my examples, I'm going to assume that I'm using the Death stance because that's the more unique among Fire and Energy, because a Fire extended Viscor looks like a great Fire Wave. So Death is going to be where you see the biggest difference. So let's just assume that I'm permanently on the Death stance. So increased power for matching elemental spells. So that means that if I'm using Death stance, then my spells that deal death damage, like Death Beam, are going to increase in damage. But casting a matching spell converts the next non-matching spell to that element. This is where everything is going to be insanely interesting. So if I cast a Death Beam, and my next spell is a Hell's Core, it's going to create a Death UE. If I use a fire stance, and I use Fire Strike, and my next spell is Viscor, it's going to convert the Viscor into the fire element. So you can mix and match elements and change the elements of your normal spells. This is going to be extremely interesting and versatile. Now, if that wasn't enough, Repeated Blast is a new spell that they have that will deal 1 stroke of AoE damage when you cast it, and then it's going to have another instance of damage 2 seconds later. This is going to be completely overpowered, especially after the nerfs to RP, because what this does is it lets you have 2 attacks in a single turn. So you cast Repeated Blast, that's 1 AoE. The next turn, let's say you use Ultimate Explosion. So Repeated Blast is going to hit its second attack with a larger radius at the same turn that you use Ultimate Explosion. So that means that you have double the charm procs in the same turn. RPs no longer gain the extra charm procs from Diamond Arrows, but MSs are going to be able to benefit from double charm procs, supposedly, with Repeated Blast. So this is going to be really, really crazy at higher level content, because MSs are going to be able to still use the AoE double charm proccing depending on how long the cooldown for repeated blast is going to be. But this is something to look out for, because this is going to be a game changer for MS, trust me. So, utility stances, Sap Strength and Expose Weakness, instead of being spells, they're just streamlined, and whenever you hit enemies with one of these stances active, it's going to debuff them. Simplifies everything. Like they say, reducing mental load, which I don't know what mental load MSs are really going to have if they don't even have to care about anybody's health anymore. They just have to look after their own health. How much mental load really are they going to have from this point on? I don't know. Spell improvements. Great Death Beam becomes learnable at level 66 and is no longer tied to the wheel. This is obviously necessary because if you have Death Stance, you need at least some kind of AoE attack that's going to allow you to change your next spell to the Death element. And Great Death Beam is going to be probably that. Lightning, I'm not sure what this is, but increased base damage and range. Strong Strike spells, increased damage and range. Ultimate Strike spells, increased damage and range. So, Wheel of Destiny adjustments. Instead of Magic Shield, you have Augmented Death Blast. So, I don't know what this means. Presumably what this means is what I said. So, if you use Great Death Beam with Death Stance, your next spell is going to have the Death element, the next unmatching spell. So if you use Repeated Blast, it's going to be a Death Repeated Blast. That's what I assume they mean when they say Augmented Death Blast, which leads to increased damage for the Repeated Blast spell, and reduced delay between blasts. So Repeated Blast has a 2-second delay. Presumably, I don't know, obviously, but it makes sense that instead of 2 seconds, if you use a Death one and you have this augment on the wheel, it's going to be 1 second instead, which could be pretty cool. And depending on how it works, maybe you would even get a third one. Who knows? Special spells are, instead of Sap Strength, you have special spells, which lead to reduced cooldown and higher damage for those spells. Those spells referring to Lightning and the Strong Strikes. Beam Mastery allows beams to hit a larger area. So again, you hit a larger area, supposedly a 3-wide beam, even though that would be kind of crazy in and of itself. But a 3-wide Great Death Beam, which benefits during the Death Stance from increased damage. And your next spell is going to be the Death element, so if you cast Repeated Blast, you're going to have even more effects. It all just chains together into a pretty interesting rotation. Hopefully Repeated Blast is going to be have a reasonable cooldown so that it would actually be utilized with weaving it between a bunch of changes and elements and stuff. Drain Body replaced by a perk supporting elemental stances. I don't know what supporting elemental stances means, but considering how overpowered all of this already sounds, this can't be bad. Focus Mastery reduced group cooldown to 2 seconds in addition to its current effect. So they're adding a different effect to Focus Mastery. New barrier mechanics. If incoming damage would exceed a mage's health, the overkill amount is multiplied by 8 and subtracted from mana. You can consider this as a type of gift of life that drains your mana. And this is crazy good, reducing the mental load from MSs even more. And this is going to be pretty crazy because if indeed mages are going to get a supreme mana potion that costs 50% more, like we discussed earlier, then we might be able to boost our mana back up pretty quickly. And if that's the case, you could sustain yourself in a lot of very dangerous situations by surviving from this mechanic alone. If mana runs out, death still follows. This mechanic could reduce one-shots while keeping them punishing. Sure, I mean, punishing in terms of you ending up with almost no mana after you would have died. Now wands. Wands will generate mana instead of costing it and gain improved range while keeping damage intentionally modest. So in other words, wands and rods will not cost mana, instead they'll regenerate mana. This is pretty much garbage. It doesn't really change anything. All this means is that they're not going to modify the damage that wands and rods do against a single target. Now, for druids, this is perhaps going to be one of the more interesting ones. Even though sorcerers are going to be pretty versatile, druids' gameplay, believe it or not, might be at least as complex with one of these stances. I'm going to talk about that at the end because it's going to be pretty long just to discuss how that specific stance would apply. But it is very interesting, and you're going to get to see why. So druids are going to get 3 new stances. Group healing stance, which is the interesting one. We're going to get to that at the end. Solo healing stance increases self-healing by 10%. I am going to assume or argue that this is going to be better than this, even in solo hunts. And I'll get to that in a second. So this one might be a flop. But anyway, self-healing by 10% is overall good, but I think this one does the same thing but better. Distributed healing stance, heal friend and nature's embrace, will also heal a second nearby ally for 30%, automatically targeting the lowest health ally. This is Sipsoft's way to compensate teams for a lack of an MS. So druids will, without needing to actively heal secondary players except the knight, for example, they have a primary CO target, and the CO is going to branch off to the next party member that needs it the most. I don't know how it's going to really work, though, because lowest health, just the lowest health number or the lowest health percentage, because depending on which one is the correct one, this could be a really huge boomer in team hunts and make things a lot less predictable, because you might find yourself healing the MS when the RP needs healing instead if the MS is lower health. So depending on how this works out, or even if it's possible to self-heal with this, it's going to be pretty interesting to experiment with. This is overall going to be what most people think is going to be the best one, but presumably the first one is even better. So what does the first one do? The first one, what it does is it doubles the cooldowns of CO and Mass Res, but 110% increased healing. So instead of CO having a 1 second cooldown, which you can spam twice every attack turn, you're now going to only be able to CO once per attack turn. That seems like a pretty huge nerf, even with the extra bonus healing, the 10% bonus that you get after 2 seconds. This seems pretty terrible, but as I'll explain later, this has a lot of potential for very interesting things. So for now, let's continue. Spell improvements. Heal Friend, Nature's Embrace, and Wrath of Nature will be made more reliable. What does Wrath of Nature being more reliable mean? Who knows? I don't know what that means, because Wrath of Nature is not a healing spell. So what does reliability mean in that kind of sense? I don't know. Maybe it's going to have a larger radius. Nature's Embrace base power increased to 2,000. I'm not sure how base power for spells works, but presumably Nature's Embrace healing increases are necessary when MSs can't UH anymore, and the only way where this is going to be any good is, for example, if you use this distributed healing stance, 30% of Grand CO are going to be transferred to a lower health ally. So if the healing is increased, then so is the healing on secondary targets. Fine, that makes sense. I like this. Strong strike spells, base power increased, range increased, likewise ultimate spells. Nothing to write home about. New spell type, forked spells. I don't know what this means, but presumably this is going to be a compensation for the fact that runes are much smaller. So I don't know what forked spell means. I assume it's like something like a chain spell, where it like forks from one enemy to another. But what does it actually mean in practice? What's the AoE? So the way it's described is fork spells are a druid exclusive targeting mode that hit a primary target and additional nearby targets. Druid will gain both earth and ice versions. But how many targets is it going to be able to chain to all enemies that are just nearby each other? If that's the case, and I could use it every turn instead of a rune, that would be great. Otherwise, just let me use runes with the same AoE as they are now, because this is going to be pretty bad unless you could use it every turn, or at the very most every other turn. But so far this seems pretty promising. I like this. If they're going to lower the range of offensive runes, at the very least druids need something to deal AoE damage in solo hunts. Wheel of Destiny adjustments. Healing Link increased to 25%. So it's slightly less shit than it was before. And maybe with some of the extra healing stances, it has some weird interactions that I can't think of at the moment. But overall, Healing Link isn't really recommended to... It's not worth the investment in wheel points to go all the way for Healing Link when it's not that impressive. But maybe it is, because now that I'm thinking about it, Healing Link will allow you to CO your EK. 30% of that will go to the lowest health ally, and you're going to be healed for 25% of the CO as well. So it heals you and your EK and another target. So maybe Healing Link isn't going to be as trash as it was before, but the increase isn't that impressive. I would expect this to be like 50%, then maybe it's worth something. Blessing of the Groves allows healing spells to critically heal. What does this mean? I don't know. What's the chance? I don't know. Does it depend on your modifiers to your rod? Who knows? I wish I did, because this sounds really, really interesting. And does it also apply to when I'm low health and the Grove would have given me a healing bonus? Does it only apply on allies that are lower on health so that they trigger the bonus from the Grove? Who knows? This is yet to be seen. It sounds really cool, and a lot of people don't really take Blessing of the Grove, even though it's pretty good. And maybe this will make it more desirable. Augmented Terror Wave, life leech increased to 10% from 5%. Bravo. Literally pointless and stupid. Augmented Ice Wave, minus 2-second cooldowns. So, and Mana Leech removed. I don't care about the Mana Leech, obviously, who gives a shit? But 2-second cooldown on Ice Wave means that you could use it every third turn instead of every fourth. This could yield very interesting rotations if the forked spells are also once every at least 3 turns or more. Because then what you could do is Ice Wave, which has a greatly increased area instead of base damage bonus, which is insane. Ice Wave actually being practical to use in a solo hunt. So lower cooldown, larger area. With forked spells, maybe with that, it's okay that the rune sizes are going to be slightly reduced. I hope that's going to be the case. New barrier mechanic, same as MS's. Rods, same as wands. So now let's get into the interesting stuff. So this first perk right here, Group Healing Stance, doubles cooldowns for Heal Friend and Mass Healing, but 110% increased healing. So everything else is a lot more simple, but this one is interesting in the following sense. So CO is only castable every 2 seconds, but that doesn't mean that you can't heal your EK every second. It just means that you have to modify your spell rotations to now not just rotate between offensive spells, you now need to rotate between healing spells with this stance. But if you do so, it's presumably very rewarding. So let's just take an example of a simple 4-second rotation. There's several 4-second rotations that I'm going to discuss here, but let's take the first one. So right now, the way things are right now, a normal repeatable rotation for an ED is CO, 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 CO. Yeah, 4 COs, 4 seconds, simple. Or, if you needed, you could do CO, mass res, CO, mass res. You can't do that anymore with this stance, because both mass res and CO cooldowns are going to be twice as long, but the benefit is that they're gonna be slightly above twice as strong. So imagine this rotation: CO, mass res, CO. You can't mass res anymore, so you're going to use Exura Vita. And then again, CO, mass res, CO, Exura Vita. Now, what this causes is a 1 second gap every 4 seconds in which the EK is not getting healed. And this is problematic, but EKs get defensive bonuses, so hopefully it's not going to be that bad. But I'm going to try to show you guys the math so that you could see how beneficial this might be. So right now, CO, 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 CO is 4 COs, and that's all you can do in 4 seconds. But with this, let's just, for the sake of simplicity, count every CO as 2 COs with twice as long of a cooldown. But because it's twice as powerful, let's just count it as 2 COs. So the rotation is going to be CO, which is 2 COs. Then mass res, which is going to be 2 mass reses. Then the third second, you're going to cast CO again, which is 2 COs, and then Exura Vita. So in 4 seconds, you get 4 COs, just like you would normally, but you also manage to squeeze in between 2 mass reses and an Exura Vita. So the knight is getting 6 healing spells, basically 3, but each of them is twice as powerful. So 6 healing spells in 4 seconds instead of 4 healing spells in 4 seconds. And because you healed yourself with mass res, then you get an Exura Vita and 2 mass reses. So essentially that's 3 healing spells on yourself every 4 seconds. This makes things pretty interesting if both you and your EK are able to soak that damage and not die from just 1 second of a missed healing rotation. This could be very, very promising. And the reason I said that the self-healing of druids increased by 10% might be worse is because of what I just said. So imagine the following rotation: Exura Vita, Mass Res, Exura Vita, Exura Max Vita. This is a repeatable 4-second rotation where you heal yourself with Exura Vita. Your second one is Mass Res, which, because you take the stance, it's like a double Mass Res in terms of healing, and a double Mass Res should be even higher healing numbers-wise than a single Exura Vita. So you're basically boosting your second spell in the rotation. Then you have a normal Exura Vita again, and then you have an Exura Max Vita. Again, neither the Exura Vita or the Max Vita get affected by this whatsoever. So if you're solo hunting, the only advantage for this is for Mass Res. But because Mass Res is twice as powerful, and you're replacing it with one of your Exura Vitas, the increase in overall healing that you're going to get per 4-second rotation is probably even more significant than the extra healing that you get from 10% times 4 seconds. So overall, this might, depending on the numbers, be less impactful than this one, even for solo hunting, not to mention team hunting. So I think the people who don't want to bother with ED spell rotations in terms of healing spell rotations are going to choose the third stance. But people who want to actually have a way more interesting playstyle are going to go for the first stance, because this one has a potential to chain your spells together in various ways, which could be seriously good. And last but not least, the helmet tiers like the momentum buff that you get when your helmet tiers trigger, is usually entirely useless because you won't notice a 2-second reduction on time to make anything useful out of it. But if you're spamming your CO hotkey, then whenever your helmet triggers, you would be able to CO twice in the same turn as you would be able to do before. So this means, hopefully, I'm not sure if this is going to be correct. I don't know how helmets are going to affect the lower cooldowns, but presumably if you have a 2-second cooldown reduction to CO, you'd be able to CO the next turn anyway. So overall, this might be a very interesting thing where the double cooldowns are not really that much of a negative as long as you you weave other healing spells between the Exura COs. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope this was informative. I'm sorry that it's pretty lengthy, but this is a pretty extensive update, and these changes are going to be extremely game-changing. So I wonder how Tibia is going to feel like after all these changes are implemented. I can't wait, though. For the most part, I would give these changes an 8 out of 10.